This segment is brought to you in part by the Canadian Historical Arms Society, owners of the Genesee Range, the premier recreational sport and training facility in Western Canada. See us online at historical-arms.com.
The Quiet Professional, a podcast about law enforcement, security, justice, and politics. We are digging deeper on the issues and going where the information takes us with access to experts and authorities. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Hey everybody, welcome back. Nathan Romas with you. Today we are going to be talking about geopolitics and Canada's role as a middle power and just how we conduct ourselves in the current environment. For that, I have Jonathan Berkshire Miller here. John is an international affairs professional with expertise on security, defense, and geoeconomic issues in the Indo-Pacific. Currently, he is a senior fellow with the Japan Institute of International Affairs and a senior fellow and director of the Foreign Affairs, National Defense, and National Security Program at the Ottawa-based Macdonald-Laurier Institute. In addition, he previously spent nearly a decade working on economic and security issues related to Asia with the Canadian federal government and worked both with the Foreign Ministry and the security community. John has contributed written pieces in places such as The Economist Intelligence Unit, Foreign Affairs, and the Globe and Mail, and been interviewed or quoted in media from the New York Times to CNN, CBC, and CTV. So welcome, John.
Thanks so much, Nathan. I think you're doing great things with this podcast. I've listened to a few, and they're really great. So it's a real privilege to be one of your guests.
Oh, thanks. As we were saying kind of offline before we started, I'm always surprised at who this actually reaches. Sometimes people reach out and sometimes they don't, but then I find out later, like, oh, this person was talking about the podcast. So it's a really cool platform. And you know what? When I started it, we were kind of at the tail end of COVID. And I thought, well, like, how can I do something that, you know, even if I have to be shut in my house, I can still work. So it's been a good platform for that, certainly. Just to start, I think one of the things that people always wonder, and I've certainly had this question too when I send some of your articles or MLI's articles around, is what exactly is a think tank? What do they do and how do they contribute to kind of the bigger picture of things going on out there? So I was wondering if we could start just by talking about you and MLI. What is it that, like, what do you do there? How does MLI contribute to the bigger discussions that are out there? And then we'll get into kind of the focus of the Indo-Pacific from that.
Well, it sounds great. I mean, and it's a really great question. I mean, and sometimes, and Nathan, I get asked if I'm doing a lecture at a university or talking to some kids who are doing their graduate programs, for example, in international affairs, and they're interested in careers there. They're sometimes intrigued. Okay, they know more about what a think tank is, but they kind of want to know specifically what does the life of a think tanker look like?
Yeah.
What precisely do they do? But before sort of getting to that, I want to talk a little bit about sort of my journey and how that sort of interplays with all of this. If you think back 20, 30, 40 years ago and you thought about foreign policy and foreign policy professionals, you probably think about folks in tweed jackets, smoking their pipes and, twirling some whiskey and talking about the world. Even when I was, going to grad school, I mean, if you think about this career, really, there would be sort of three options in your head. I always say there is one that you become a diplomat, you work for the foreign ministry. The other one is that you join the United Nations and do all sorts of good things around the world. And the third is that you resign yourself to the fate of becoming a professor and teaching all of the next generation about this. The reality, which I think is it's scary in a lot of ways, but it's actually really exciting, is that there's so many different foreign policy actors now in today's space. Mm-hmm. Be it innovation companies, be it private sector actors, be it chambers of commerce, be it academics, think tanks, geopolitical risk, which is another area that I'm involved in now too. It's really exciting for someone who is getting into this space, and I think my sort of career has sort of touched on some of those. So maybe it's my insatiable desire for curiosity that you see the different types of actors who engage in foreign policy. And number one, trying to bring those folks together So rather than just having, and this sort of goes to your question about what does MLI do and what do think tanks do, one of the things that we do is that we think about a particular issue. So say it's Canada's relationship with China, and we try to say, okay, we're not looking for just the most, quote unquote, learned, because we feel like all Canadians, have a stake in this. But we want to say, can we take 20 or 30 folks who can come at this from a different angle? The last thing we want is a room where everyone just sort of nods their head and says, "Oh, that's fantastic. I 100% agree with you. I don't have any solutions, but I agree with your diagnosis." We want a variety of voices, be it some from the youth, some from the business side, some from the current government, some from provinces, some from. I think it's great, for example, that we have local law enforcement engaged in these issues. I mean, this is not just something is purely an Ottawa centric issue. So that's a little bit about what sort of some of the things we do at MLI. The institute itself has a few different focal points. So I formerly actually led their foreign affairs, national security work. I'm now actually there as a senior fellow because I've started up a geopolitical advisory firm in Ottawa. But we also do domestic policy, we do Indigenous policy, we do energy and security. And I think the general thesis behind it, or the general rationale, is that we want to make Canada better. We're trying to get folks who have ideas. We don't care about the letters behind your name. Mm-hmm. We want folks who are serious and creative about ways to improve Canada, and that's I think that's the simplest way to describe the work we do.
Yeah, you know what? I think that's a really good way to look at it. Do you see yourselves as being very down the middle, or do you think you have more of a conservative type bent to some of the stuff you put out, or is it more liberal, or do you even choose to kind of describe yourselves as such?
So it's interesting. I mean, and our founder, Brian Lee Crowley, will often say this if you ask him that question. The origin of the institute, and one of the reasons it's called the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, is because we have a conservative and a liberal, two of the original prime ministers, and even that. I mean, even the naming itself, I think, unfortunately, now has become very controversial, just because we're in a state right now in Canada where you can't talk about anything historical, even if there were some challenges with previous historic figures. We come from the mandate that we actually have to talk about our history, learn from our history. There are a lot of positive parts of it, and some challenging parts too. But going back to the naming, we've done that quite intentional, not just from a historical legacy perspective, but actually from a bipartisan perspective. The sort of the mandate of what we do, we want to be ruthlessly bipartisan. Some of the issues that we focus on may be perceived as trending more towards one sort of party of the day rather than the other. But by no means do we want to pander to a political audience, or we actually can't. So I think that our focus is, again, at the onset, as I mentioned, to throw the best ideas out there for Canadians, rather than pander to a partisan audience.
Yeah, I think that's something that's difficult to kind of combat nowadays, where everybody kind of instantly gets a label. So it's like if you're a think tank or your media or something, everyone right away starts with, well, that's right or left. And then the conversation kind of goes from there, but it instantly like colors your opinion, and it gives you, all your bias will come into that. And then you start looking at articles or whatever people are saying with a certain different lens. And I mean, I like some of the stuff that I read from MLI. I think it's like the most down the middle. It's just calling things what it is. It's like you can't really call it one side or the other. That's why I really like some of the stuff that is put out through the organization. And I mean, certainly, you guys, obviously, by being on this podcast alone, you're not looking for the best and the brightest. I'm not a philosophical type person. I just kind of go by the evidence that I see, and I really like to ask questions and be inquisitive of this stuff. I mean, maybe that's natural just being in law enforcement. I'm always kind of looking and listening and trying to figure things out, but by no means am I the expert. So that's why we get people like you in the room.
Well, no, I mean, we need that. And I mean, going back to my point, I mean, everyone has a stake and a role in this. So, I mean, when you think of the election and whether you voted or whether you didn't, I mean, we all have a stake in Canada's future. And I think whether it's on national security, whether it's on, our malnourished state of defense, whether it's how we engage with the world, if we don't have folks across Canada speaking up for what they believe Canada's role should be, then it's not going to work. I mean, I've seen this time and time again. I mean, to be honest, voices like us can easily be ignored if there's not a wider sentiment across Canada that supports this thing. So, I mean, I think one example I'll give you is on national defense and security spending. So Canada's been a free rider for several years. We've made a commitment to spend 2% of our gross domestic product on defense spending. We've not come close to that, hovering around 1.3, 1.4%, while other NATO allies have surpassed that commitment. What has finally sort of pushed governments over the side is that they've realized successive public polling is it's beyond just the Ottawa quote unquote elite or the people saying this is what you should do. They don't really care what some former generals would say or even what a think tank would say. But when they start seeing polling and people are saying, look, we're realizing the world is changing, whether it's Russian revisionism in Europe, whether it's China's activities in Asia. And, unfortunately, what's happening right now in the Can-US relationship, I don't think that should be the only catalyst for this, but I think that has sort of the silver lining of it. It has resulted in a wake-up call where Canadians are saying, look, maybe we should be doing more to take care of ourselves. So just to sort of reiterate this point, like all ideas from all Canadians and all inquisitive sort of, processes, really, it helps the work of Canada.
Yeah. Well, you know what? Since we're kind of on that topic now, we'll jump into Canada's role in the world. One of the things that I think has been missing largely, we'll say during Trudeau's era, is the direction from the PM level of, first of all, what exactly is a Canadian? What should Canada be, and how we kind of conduct ourselves in this on the planet, like where we fall within all these relationships and what we should be doing. I think that direction has largely been missing. I kind of want to get your opinion on just that statement alone. And I just to add to that, though, I think if we had those things, especially over the last 10 years, we might not see some of the issues we see with like recruiting in the Canadian Armed Forces. Maybe we would be able to stand up for ourselves a little more on the world stage, like when it comes to things like foreign interference. So just kind of, I want to get your take on what is Canada's role? How much can we actually do as, we'll say, a middle power? And if that has even changed, feel free to correct me on that. But where do we kind of stand in the world as we are right now?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is I think that the current vantage point, and a lot of this sort of goes back to the Cold War period, but I think there's a bit of a historical view of the way Canada should engage with the world in the past several decades. I mean, if you think of Canada and our legacy and our history in World War II and World War I and conflicts before that, I mean, we've had quite a distinguished legacy of when we feel that our values or interests are at stake or those of our allies, we have stood up and we've lost the most precious lives and blood and treasure for fighting for what we care about. So I think there has been a long history historically of Canada doing that. I think the current sort of foreign policy lens, and a lot of this, again, I think comes out from the Cold War era, is I use the example of this, the Canadian Heritage commercials, which some of you might remember, Nathan, but
yeah.
And there are a number of funny ones, but the one I often point to on this is the Canadian United Nations peacekeeping presence in Cyprus, where you'd have a commercial there where you'd have a Greek Cypriot and a Turkish Cypriot, and both of them are quarreling. They have a dispute over the island. And of course, at this time, because it's a nice Canadian Heritage commercial, there's no guns or knives. One has a stick and one has a rock. And then in comes the Canadian peacekeeper with a blue helmet and says, stop, this is the United Nations and I'm Canadian. And then the nice, music that ends up the commercial and says, Canada did a great contribution to the United Nations. I I use that in a sort of polemic way just to say that we have to get out of this mentality that the world it was like this, that we have this easy idea where Canada can insert itself in when it has the time, resources, kind of almost like an elective in university or a luxury item where you could kind of pick up and say, okay, now is the time for us to do something in Mali or something. Now is the time for us to send a mission to Haiti. And that's the right thing to do. And, I think that we'd be perceived well in the world if we did that. There are actually things we need to do absolutely for our own, like hardcore national security, like a number of challenges, whether it's in the Arctic and now, as we see the role of Russia globally, but also rebuilding its icebreaker fleet, China collaborating with Russia in the Arctic. The old sort of limitations of geography are not there. We see this in the cyber realm. We see this in economic espionage, et cetera. So, I think the point we've been trying to make is when crafting grand strategy that it's not a luxury item anymore. It probably never was. But the idea that you could just sort of, dispatch someone over to Vienna and that would be your contribution to the world and we were safe because we were planted in North America, that reality has been shattered long ago, and we sort of need to wake up and get with the party. The other sort of last point I'll mention on this too is that we also need to realize that our strategic choices are very different than other friends around the world, even like ones in Europe and Asia that are very like-minded with us. So I'll give examples. And I lived in Japan for several years. Great country, we share a lot with them. But Japan's sort of geostrategic viewpoint is fundamentally different from Canada. We are a shared U.S. ally. Yes, we care about democracy. We are in the same clubs, but they are in the heart of the belly of the beast of East Asia, right next to China, right next to North Korea, Russia in the north, and they have a territorial dispute with them. We are couched in North America. So we need to, rather than this tendency of saying that we can sort of, have the similar choices to countries in Europe or similar choices to countries in Asia, we have to realize fundamentally that geography does play a bit of a defining feature. And that, I think, is the thing that disappoints me a little bit in the discussion recently on the Can-US relationship is that, look, I get it. I mean, I'm a proud Canadian too, and nobody wants to see the relationship at the point where it's at. But at the same point, we need to be realistic about our options going forward. And, we're not in a world where we can just shut our eyes and say, okay, we're just going to pretend the US doesn't exist. And we'll engage with Europe and Asia instead. It's just not realistic.
Well, what I don't get is why we don't have that kind of talk from our administration, why we don't get those direct messages, like exactly what you just said. Why aren't the politicians just saying that, right? And then they come up with I'm going to call it like the silly sayings, like elbows up and stuff. Like, okay, we're in the real world now. We're not just coming up with slogans and different things. Like, give us the real goods and the detail behind it. I think, and you're starting to see a shift in how people want to get their information. And I think this comes into play here where people now are kind of getting burned out from all the headlines and the sensationalization of things and the clickbait. And they're going to these longer form discussions and looking for that depth. But I don't think we've seen that change from the political class. Why are we not getting that? Is there just like no room for grace if somebody makes the wrong decision, or like are they scared to say these things and anger the public on one side, or those political relationships country to country? Like, why are people not just saying the truth and what we need to do about it?
Well, yeah, and I wish that I have similar desires that I wish that was the case, that we did speak to this more. I think we're living in a bit of a post-nuance world where 1,000 things can be true at the same point. Like we can challenge what the U.S. is doing on tariffs and other things, and of course, nobody wants to hear the discussions on the 51st state. I was just in Washington last week, and I think in a lot of our meetings we clearly said, okay, that's just not going to happen as well. Yeah. We can have those conversations. But at the same point, the overly dramatic stuff about, the relationship will be forever fractured and it will, we're never going back. And to answer you, it really, why are politicians going in this direction? It's politics. It's especially ahead of leading into the election. This is something that resonated deeply with Canadians. It offended Canadians, some of the actions of the Trump administration, and it was highly torqued up. It was highly torqued up in an election period where, of course, the current party that now has got another mandate really took the opportunity. They seized the opportunity of this moment in time and used that politically. But I think the point I think we're making on this is that what about the long term interests of Canada? So it's it's great to defend our sovereignty and talk about pushing back against some of this rhetoric, but where is the long term sort of strategic lens on this? And the last point I'll make on this too is that embedded in this, actually, there's a lot of things that we have had in our control that we haven't done.
Yes.
So this is the message that I think is getting lost in some of the pushback against the Trump administration is, let's take defense spending, which we've talked about before as an example, or national security culture. We should have been doing more for a long time. And this is a message that has been bipartisan from the U.S. Like this is, the Biden administration, even though it articulated differently, had been saying the same thing. I mean, the Obama administration had been saying the same thing. This is a long-standing issue for Canada and other U.S. allies. So the idea that we sort of, paint over or color over some of these things, our own sort of deficiencies in the relationship. And that's not to whitewash the way that the Americans are treating us, but I think we need to look in the mirror also and take our own agency and say, like, look, we've had ample opportunity and time to rectify some of these issues. So I would focus dual track on saying, okay, no, we're not going to be the 51st state to the Americans, but at the same point, let's focus on ourselves. Like, how can we improve ourselves? And let's address the mistakes that we've made ourselves. I think that would be the great starting point.
Am I fair in saying that we're still a middle power? Is that even a correct term to use now, or are we maybe sliding from that? Because if we're not leading in a lot of these areas and we're not taking some critical things seriously, where do we kind of fall within that talk, I guess?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of Canadian strategists and academics used to like the term middle power, and some still probably do. I mean, I think it depends on the way you frame it. I mean, I think you could almost say being a middling power. But my one critique of the sort of middle power sort of thesis, I do think, of course, in general terms, we're not a great power in a military sense. That's absolutely
maybe I'll clarify real quick too, is just maybe in like the influence sphere and the ability to have that influence outside of our country and project things political, policy wise, but not militarily.
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think, I mean, look in the glass half full. I mean, we're involved in almost every key forum, G7, NATO, APEC, et cetera, alphabet soup. I mean, so we're Canada's founding member of most of these international forums, or the international financial system. We're in most of the different institutions as well. So clearly, we have a stake that other countries, such as Mongolia or Sierra Leone, do not. We're at a level where we can influence certain issues. I think the challenge for us, though, too, is that often in the middle power construct, there is a thought that we could band together with other quote unquote middle powers and chart a sort of a new course. I think the correct way to think about it is how do you sort of assuage sometimes and make things malleable with the great powers, and particularly with the U.S. And this has always been the challenge for the democratic middle powers like South Korea, like Japan, like Australia, like Canada. The idea, in my mind, is not to chart a different course from the great powers, but it's how to sort of hedge in the great powers. Number one, keep them interested, and I think that's something that's going to be a project for Canada and U.S. allies in the coming years. Is rather than push the Americans away, we need to actually keep the Americans engaged. But also find a way to shape your own sort of destiny as much as you can in this world. So rather than the sort of illusion of creating your own path that is completely independent and shared with other middle powers, I think the real sort of shrewd way to think about it is like, how do we shape the edges of a world that really, in many ways, is defined by great powers and increasingly defined by great powers. So I think that's the sort of space that I hope Canada's more on, because I think that we've sort of defaulted, rather than really playing hard in that game, we've defaulted a lot into the multilateral sphere, saying, okay, well, we actually think there's another option, which is international institutions reshaping things, and Canada can play a big voice there. I'm not of the view that that's completely irrelevant, but I think that we've seen time and time again that those institutions have failed us. So I think our resources would be better placed in the shaping of some of the great power dynamics, rather than, for example, spending all of our resources at the United Nations or other international institutions.
I feel like just looking at where we are geographically and the size of our country and stuff, like we can't always go and rely on others. Like kind of like you're saying, we can't always just think, okay, we're going to join this group and we're all going to get along and they're going to have our interests and we'll have their interests. It's like we're isolated to a certain extent, right? Like there's only 2 of us or 3 of us on this continent, and we're kind of being encroached on. If not already, we have things going on inside the country where others are kind of meddling around. I feel like we just sometimes aren't assertive enough. We don't take our own security and some of the things that we're looking at serious. But just kind of on something you were mentioning before, talking about kind of pushing away from the US, that is something I want to kind of discuss. So you see, China has been coming over and being like, hey, US is not necessarily your friend anymore. What about us? And kind of pushing their way in. I think it's kind of interesting. Like when you look at, if we talk about like human rights issues, environment, foreign interference type stuff, with all that going on, we're still kind of making deals with China. At what point do we go, we don't want to play anymore with you? Like there's too much going on and there's too many bad things. Is it possible for us to separate from them even, and go closer to the US? I think it's dangerous if we're totally ignoring the US, or we're choosing to separate from them, one of our longest allies, law enforcement, intelligence, all intertwined. Like, I think that'd be very dangerous. But it just seems like a very precarious world where China is now buddy with everybody, even though they have all these other things going on where we're like, hey, human rights and environment, but they're kind of moving in. So how do we manage that relationship? Where should we be going? I think I kind of know what your answer might be, but what should we be doing with that?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting, a great multifaceted question. So I'll try to be as succinct as possible on this. But I mean, first of all, from the Chinese vantage point, it doesn't surprise me, of course, that they want to reset the deck. And it's very easy for an ambassador to come on a power play. I think he was recently on CTV, and to say we're ready for a new start and let's just kind of forget everything that happened last few years. And it's like, well, you can forget everything that happened, but we had some citizens detained for over 1,000 days. You just executed a number of Canadians in China, for offenses or alleged offenses, and in addition to what you've been doing.
Well, and they blamed Canada. They blamed Canada in that meeting quite a bit for I think it was the tariffs. They were saying, no, you put those on first. We were reciprocating.
Exactly. So I mean, I guess the thing is like they're putting the smiley face, but the fangs are absolutely still there, and they're diving deeper into our skin. So I think we're seeing this on in the foreign interference side. We're seeing this with economic coercion, with tariffs, domestically in the bilateral relationship, but then regionally, if you look, okay, how is China engaging in the world? The trend lines are getting worse. I mean, you see this in the South China Sea with some of their disputes with their neighbors. You see this in the Taiwan Straits, with the sort of the choking of Taiwan, both militarily through exercises, espionage activities there, in addition to sort of picking off all of Taiwan's diplomatic allies or the few that remain. So I guess my sort of counter to the Chinese offer is that, look, not only have you not changed at all, you want a clean slate, but the trend lines are worsening. So why should Canada take that up? I think the second point of this discussion, I think this goes into the US angle, which you mentioned, is that I do worry about this, where at a time where the United States-Canada relationship is getting more attention in a sort of a national security lens than it ever has, in a sort of adversarial way. It's always been a key security partner, as you mentioned, in Five Eyes and other arrangements. But the fact that now there's a lot of concern about the current political administration and some of the things it's saying, I do worry that this opens the door even more for China. I do have hope that public perception doesn't support that, and I still think that even the Liberal government, which has traditionally been more engagement friendly with China, would be very cautious to be too demonstrated in engagement. But I do also have some worries that this may couch itself in something like, look, we're not going to re-engage China as a main principal partner, but at the same point, a quote unquote balance in the relationship is needed, and let's get back to more pragmatism. And you can read into that a sort of softening of the approach. So I think that's something that we have to watch out for. And my sort of final point on this is, and this was sort of when Canada started constructing a more principled strategy for how to deal with China and how to deal with the Indo-Pacific region, which is sort of one of the new monikers to talk about Asia. I think the premise there was that what happens there matters for Canada. It matters for Canadian interests, for Canadian citizens, Canada's economy. It's not because the U.S. is telling us to do something. And I think there are a lot of voices, I think, politically, bureaucratically, and in other spaces, definitely in the private sector, that will try to take this moment in time to say that I think the China tensions are largely as a result of the U.S. And we constructed our policies in China because of American pressure. I fundamentally reject that. I think that those challenges are there and they're structural in nature. Our European friends are facing similar ones. Our friends in Asia, like Japan and South Korea, are facing similar ones. So I think we need to get out of this mentality that it's a zero-sum U.S.-China dynamic, that that's the only reason why we have problems with China is because of the Americans. And that will hopefully inform a realistic policy with China. My last sort of point on this is that it doesn't mean that we cut China out of the map. I mean, it is a large country that we're going to have to find a way to exist with, absolutely. But that any form of engagement needs to be done with full eyes wide open, and they need to be seen in the adversarial way that they're acting. I mean, that's sort of your actions necessitate the sort of the policies that we sort of put in place to deal with you. And I think that's the situation that we currently have with People's Republic of China.
One thing that maybe Canadians don't really pick up on is kind of our relationships with the Indo-Pacific. We usually hear about Europe, maybe just because of history and culture and a lot of similarities. Obviously, PM Carney's talking about doing more dealing with them. But just how important is the Indo-Pacific to Canada? As you kind of mentioned there, some of our relationship already, but we see some defense opportunities with South Korea. They're talking about submarines and building some different things for us. But just how important, how intertwined are we actually? Because I don't think we get a lot of news on the Indo-Pacific here in Canada. Maybe if you're in Vancouver, but outside of that, I can't really think of much that really makes the mainstream news. So can you just talk a bit about the relationship between us and that region?
Yeah, I think it's really, significant. So even, demographically, some of our largest diasporas, most of our largest diasporas in our immigrant flows are coming from the Indo-Pacific. Historically, whether it's from India, China, there's been a big surge in migration from Vietnam and the Philippines. So I think all of this presents a lot of opportunities for us, both to grow Canada, but also economically in the way that we engage with these countries if we use it in the right way. It also actually poses a number of different risks too. And I think we've seen this in particular with, both with the Chinese and the Indian relationship. I think the Chinese relationship, being susceptible to transnational repression and monitoring and espionage and interference. And we've seen some similar things with India as well, although there's different layers of that and different challenges. Mm-hmm. So there's the demographic sort of tie-in there. There's the immense economic opportunity. This is the growth. The economic growth in the world is not coming from Europe. It's not coming from Canada. It's the U.S. has been pretty stable, and I think there's opportunities there. But the Indo-Pacific really is an area of real immense opportunities, and actually beyond just China. China's demographics are actually declining, and there's a lot of economic challenges and flashing red signs that I think we should be watching on China. So actually, the economic growth models are looking at Southeast Asia, are looking at India. There's some really enticing opportunities for Canadian business to engage. So that's another sort of factor. And then the other reason I think we should care a lot about this part of the world is number one, we are a Pacific nation. So if you think about Canada versus Germany, for example, I mean, not to say Germany doesn't have interests in Asia, but I mean, look at Germany on a map, and I mean, they sell Volkswagens there and BMWs, but they're not exposed the way that Canada is. I mean, we do. The Pacific Ocean's large, but we absolutely are a Pacific nation. And then what fascinates me about that part of the world, it's scary, but also interesting, is that if you look at, especially in the Indo-Pacific from a security dynamic, yes, there hasn't been too many significant interstate conflicts in recent years. There are a few, but it's the arms buildup in that part of the world. We have Russia, which is still an Indo-Pacific country with nuclear weapons. We have North Korea with nuclear weapons. We have China with nuclear weapons. We have large countries that do not have nuclear weapons, like South Korea and Japan, which have capable militaries. And then you go down to South Asia, and you have India and Pakistan, who are recently quarreling and are both nuclear powers too. So it's a petri dish of a lot of rivalries and challenges and immense amounts of power that I think we would be. It's beholden on us to make sure that we pay attention to it, because if things go in the wrong way, I think that what we're seeing happening in Europe now will just be a preview or a trailer to some of the real challenges that we could face if we see contention and conflict in the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah. Do you think, so maybe I'll just kind of go back to China a little bit and just some of the issues we were talking about. Is that just something that we kind of like, would people just have to learn to live with? Like, hey, we have to do business with them. Like, we don't really have a choice when it comes to a lot of the economic growth that we're looking for. So we kind of have to, I don't know, be accepting of there's going to be some things they do that we don't agree with, but they even have different definitions of like what a human right would be. So to them, maybe it isn't a human right issue. For us, it is. So there's a difference in definitions and how we see things. So is it just kind of accepting like, hey, they're going to do X, Y, and Z, how they do it? But we are looking for these other opportunities, so we have to do business with them. Are we kind of stuck in that realm of things?
Well, I think it's on the sort of eyes wide open side economically. I think that, so there's been a sort of a saying going around amongst, and I think Canada's sort of involved in this when thinking about economic security, in particular with China, is the small garden with a high wall. So the idea that if you have a large garden or a large lawn, there are small parts of that garden that you absolutely need to protect, and other parts of the lawn could be open for business. I think what we're seeing, and those gardens are usually as it relates to national security. So maybe it's on quantum, maybe it's on AI, maybe it's on dual use technologies that China is very interested in, has shown an intention and a capability to essentially steal when it's in its interest. What we're seeing, though, is we're realizing that, especially with some of these technologies and capabilities and leverage points in the economy, that this model is a little bit challenging. The idea of the entire lawn being massively walled is also challenging. So I think we're getting to the point of bigger gardens. Maybe it's a gazebo now rather than a small sort of rose patch. So bigger gardens with higher walls, but still some pockets of areas to engage. And one of the challenges to there's this, two phrases, kind of decoupling, which is sort of to completely divorce yourself. And the other one is like de-risking. So the idea of like kind of finding ways to manage the risk. And that this is sort of the gardens with the high wall approach. I think the challenge of decoupling, so to absolutely divorce yourself entirely from China economically, and the Americans are facing this right now, and part of the reason why Trump sort of buckled on his tariffs with China is that the supply chains that interconnect with China in the region, it's really hard. So even if you were to say, I'm just not going to accept exports from China, I mean, it's sourced through Southeast Asia, sourced through sometimes Japan and South Korea. So until that mentality changes, and until our allies and partners in the region that we do want to trade with changes, it becomes really challenging to have the full scale, economic divorce. So that's I think we need to almost do like a de-risking plus. It's we need to speed up our de-risking process. But I think that the entire decoupling right now is really challenging.
No, I really like that answer. You know what? I think that's the perspective that a lot of people need out there. That kind of takes us away from just the screaming and shouting and the protesting and everything. And it's like, hey, the world is not a perfect place, and there is nuance to be had in these discussions. And you got to manage relationships, and unfortunately, sometimes you're gonna have to deal with the devil, or however that's gonna work. We saw that during the world wars, right? Like, you're making friends with some enemies because there's a bigger enemy, or you just have to, I think, look at things with a certain perspective, and I think you really provide that there. We're just coming up to the end of our time. I want to make sure you just talk about some of the stuff that you have coming up. So, I know you're always touring and doing speaking engagements, but any sort of papers or projects or anything that's coming up that you would like to mention here?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the focal points that we have, we talked about quite a bit in this call, is the CAN-US relationship. So we've been paying a good amount of attention on this, whether it's through visits and other engagements. And I think the reason there is that, when things are at their worst, I think is when we need the most attention and the most sort of clarified ideas on this. So I think right now is the time to be thinking ambitiously about that relationship in a global sense. So rather than getting stuck in the sort of the weeds of trade agreements and things like this, which is, there's other people who are tasked with negotiating those and resolving those. I think we need to be thinking big term, long picture about what does a CAN-US relationship look like globally for the next 10, 15, 20 years. So that's sort of one project that we're focused on. I think another thing that we're paying a lot of attention on is how do we connect with the private sector on this? And this is something that we do with our geopolitical advisory, is that I think the private sector for too long has viewed geopolitical issues as sort of the remit of government, and sort of has just sort of gotten out of the way and said, look, that's just not our thing. The government deals with national security. The government deals with grand strategy. But what I said at the onset of this podcast is that we're, most Canadians now are internationally engaged in some sort of form, and businesses are exposed. I think this is especially acute with some of the small and medium enterprises that maybe don't have the resources or sort of the international sort of focal points or staff members to sort of give them that guide. So that's something that we've been focused on a lot with some of our private sector stakeholders and clients, that we sort of navigate them through that process of explaining some of the different geopolitical challenges that they may face.
Awesome. Last thing, where can people find you and your work? Obviously, there's the MLI website. I'll put that up in the episode description. But where else would you like them if they want to connect or get in touch?
Sure. I mean, they can follow me on X /Twitter at JBMLLR, and they can also find, I have most of my writings and engagements they can find on my personal website, which is www.jberkshiremiller.com. There they can find most of my publications, engagements. It's sort of a one-stop shop. If you want to fall asleep on a rainy day and you want to read some articles, you can go there.
It's honestly, it's fascinating discussion. I really like talking about this stuff, and I know a lot of other people are starting to get more engaged in it. So I think people would be doing themselves a big service to actually go and read some of these things and get engaged and start asking questions, right? And if you don't know an answer, you don't know where to find it, ask, and someone will put you in touch with the right people. So I want to say thanks for being on here today. I really appreciate your time, and we'll get you out of here just on time.
Okay, thanks so much, Nate. This was a lot of fun, and hopefully you'll have me back again sometime.
We'll talk soon. Hey, everyone. Thanks for listening in and following along with the discussions. Be sure to click the follow or subscribe button on your respective listening platform. Also, check out the Quiet Professional on X and Instagram under TQP780. And most importantly, please share where you can. Everyone has a part to play in getting these education and information pieces out there, so pass it along. Thanks again.